The sound in the principal's office was not a scream. It was a tectonic shift. Seo Mujin stood frozen, his large, tattooed hand gripping the edge of a mahogany desk so hard the wood groaned. The ink of a coiled dragon on his neck seemed to tighten with his pulse. Across from him, the young, fragile Mayerm stood taller than she had in 3 years. Her lips, usually sealed in a thin, haunting line, were parted. "He didn't do it," she whispered. The voice was small, rusty from disuse, but it carried the weight of 1,000 days of silence. The security guards paused, their hands hovering over their holsters. The rigid school administrator, who had just spent an hour detailing Mujin's violent associations and unfit guardianship, went pale. Mujin didn't look at the guards. He didn't look at the report on the desk. He looked only at Mayerm, a single, heavy tear carving a path through the cold mask of a man the world feared. The girl who hadn't made a sound since the fire had finally found her weapon. And she was using it to save the monster, who had been her only shield. The St. Jude Academy sat atop the damp, gray cliffs of Seattle like a fortress of old money secrets and clinical perfection. Inside, the air was a mixture of floor wax, expensive wool, and the unspoken rules of the elite. To the faculty, Seo Mujin was a stain on their pristine ledger, a man whose wealth was too loud, whose tattoos were too dark, and whose presence suggested a world of shadows that didn't belong in a classroom. He was a gang leader in their eyes, a predator masquerading as a parent. But to Mayerm, the 10-year-old girl with skin the color of rich earth and eyes that had seen too much light, Mujin was the only thing that made the world quiet. For 3 years, Mayerm had been a ghost in the hallways. She sat in the back of her classes, her fingers moving in a blur as she filled sketchbooks with strange, geometric patterns, lines that intersected with the precision of a blueprint but the soul of a prayer. She spoke to no one. She looked at no one. Then came the report. An administrator, convinced that Mujin's frequent, silent visits and the armed men in his foyer were signs of danger, called for an emergency intervention. They wanted Mayerm removed. They wanted security to protect her from the man who gave her a home. But they didn't see what Zuri, the evening registrar, saw from her desk in the corner. Zuri, an exile herself, recognized the look in Mujin's eyes. It wasn't the look of a captor. It was the look of a man drowning in a silence he didn't know how to break. As the gates of the school threatened to close on Mujin for good, the mystery wasn't in his past. It was in the words Mayerm was finally ready to say. "Welcome. Let me know your location in the comments so I can see where viewers are tuning in from around the world. If you haven't subscribed yet, make sure you do so you don't miss upcoming releases. Now, let's get into the story." The atmosphere in the registrar's office at St. Jude Academy was thick with the scent of ozone and judgment. Zuri sat behind a desk of polished oak, her fingers hovering over a keyboard that felt louder than usual in the oppressive silence. She was a woman who moved through the world with a forced invisibility, a former professor whose credentials had been stripped by a political scandal back home, now reduced to auditing the academic files of children who would never know her name. Across the room, the head administrator, a man named Sterling whose suit was as sharp as his tone, paced the length of the Persian rug. He was holding a file with a red tab, the file of Mayerm. "It's a liability, Zuri," Sterling snapped, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "The girl hasn't spoken in 3 years, not a word to her teachers, not a word to the school psychologist, and then there's the guardian." He spat the word as if it were a foul taste. "Seo Mujin, have you seen the men who drop her off? Black SUVs, earpieces, suits that cost more than my car. The police records on his associates are as long as my arm. We are an educational institution, not a safe house for the Korean mob." Zuri didn't look up. She was focused on the digital scan of Mayerm's latest incident. It wasn't a fight or a failure. It was a drawing. Mayerm had filled an entire sheet of graph paper with a series of interlocking indigo lines. To Sterling, it was proof of a fractured mind. To Zuri, it felt like a cry for help written in a language the school was too arrogant to learn. "The report is filed," Sterling continued, stopping at the window to look down at the courtyard. "Security will be here for the afternoon pickup. We're flagging his guardianship as unstable. If he wants to keep that girl, he'll have to do it in a courtroom, not on my campus." Zuri finally raised her eyes. Her gaze was steady, tempered by years of surviving her own tragedies. "And the girl, sir? Have you asked Myrm what she wants?" Sterling laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "She doesn't want anything, Zuri. She doesn't speak. Silence is the absence of a will." He walked out, leaving the file on her desk. Zuri reached out and touched the paper. She thought of the man she had seen in the foyer, Seo Mujin. He was a man of immense physical presence, his jaw always set in a grim line, the dark ink of a dragon's tail peeking out from the collar of his tailored shirts. He never raised his voice. He never made a scene. He simply stood by the door every day at 3:30 p.m., waiting for Myrm with a patience that felt more like penance than power. Zuri opened the folder to the very back. Hidden behind the medical reports and the tuition receipts was a single, handwritten note from Mujin to the school. "She hears everything. Please do not speak of the fire in front of her. She is not broken. She is waiting." The fire. Zuri had heard the rumors. A tragedy in the international district that had claimed Myrm's parents and Mujin's younger brother. Mujin hadn't just taken her in, he had tied his soul to hers in the wreckage. Zuri began to type, but she wasn't filing the report Sterling wanted. She began to cross-reference Myrm's drawings with the linguistics database she still secretly accessed from her university days. As the sun began to set over the Seattle cliffs, the mystery of the gang leader and the silent girl began to shift. Zuri realized that Sterling was right about one thing: silence was a weapon, but he was wrong about who was holding it. The Library of St. Jude was a cathedral of leather-bound history, the kind of place where even a footfall felt like an intrusion. Zuri worked the late shift, the hours when the wealthy students had gone home to their mansions and the building belonged to the shadows. She had brought Myrm's drawing with her, tucked inside a folder of her own research. Myrm was often left in the library for an hour after school, waiting for Mujin to finish his business meetings. The girl sat at a small table in the corner, her charcoal pencil moving with a rhythmic, scratching sound that was the only music in the room. Zuri approached slowly, not wanting to startle the girl. She placed a tray with a small cup of caffeine-free tea and a slice of apple on the table. Myrm didn't look up, but her pencil paused for a fraction of a second, a silent acknowledgement. "The lines are very precise, Myrm," Zuri said softly, her voice a low hum. "They remind me of something I saw a long time ago, in a village where the elders used to write on the earth because they didn't want the wind to take their secrets." Myrm's hand tightened on the pencil. She drew a sharp, vertical line that intersected 3 others. Zuri leaned in closer. Her heart skipped a beat. She recognized the pattern. It was Nsibidi, an ancient Nigerian script used for secret communication, but it was being altered. Myrm wasn't just drawing, she was translating. At the edges of the Nsibidi symbols were small, delicate Korean Hanja characters woven into the design like ivy. "You're building a bridge, aren't you?" Zuri whispered. Suddenly, the heavy doors of the library swung open. The air in the room changed instantly. It became cold, pressurized, and dangerous. Seo Mujin walked in. He didn't look like a man coming to pick up a child. He looked like a man walking onto a battlefield. His eyes scanned the room, landing on Zuri with a sharp, piercing intensity. He walked toward the table, his heavy footsteps echoing. Up close, the tattoos on his hands were visible, a map of a life spent in the dark. "Is there a problem?" Mujin asked. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone, surprisingly calm despite the tension in his shoulders. "No problem, Mr. Seo," Zuri said, standing her ground. "We were just looking at Myrm's work." Mujin's gaze fell to the drawing. His expression didn't change. But Zuri noticed the way his throat moved as he swallowed. He knew what was on that paper. He knew exactly what the girl was doing. "The school thinks she is unstable," Zuri said, her voice dropping so only he could hear. "They filed a report today. Security is watching the gates. They think you are a danger to her." Mujin looked at Zuri, and for a second the mask of the underworld boss slipped. There was a profound, aching vulnerability in his eyes, the look of a man who was prepared to lose his life, but not his daughter. "They see the ink," Mujin said, his voice a low vibration. "They don't see the child." He reached out and placed his hand over Myram's. The contrast was striking, his large, scarred hand with the dragon's tail, and her small, smooth palm. Myram didn't pull away. She leaned her head against his arm, a gesture of absolute trust that shattered the administrator's entire incident report. "You can read it," Mujin stated. It wasn't a question. He had noticed the way Zuri was looking at the Nsibidi symbols. "I can," Zuri replied, "and I think I know what she's trying to say." Mujin stared at her for a long moment, a silent evaluation. He was deciding if she was an enemy to be silenced or an ally to be trusted. Finally, he gave a short, sharp nod. "The library closes in 10 minutes, he said, his voice returning to its professional coldness. "Do not be late tomorrow, Myram." He turned and walked out, his black coat billowing behind him. Myram picked up her pencil and drew one final symbol at the bottom of the page. It was the Nsibidi sign for witness. Zuri watched them go, her mind racing. The report was already in the system, but the mystery had just evolved. This wasn't a story of a gang leader and a victim. This was a story of two people using a forgotten language to survive a world that wanted to silence them both. And Zuri realized that she was no longer just a registrar. She was the only one who could translate the truth before the schools, security, destroyed everything. The rain in Seattle didn't just fall. It haunted the glass walls of St. Jude Academy, blurring the line between the prestigious interior and the gray, unforgiving world outside. Zuri stood in the narrow aisle of the restricted archives, the scent of old parchment and damp stone clinging to her sweater. She was supposed to be filing late entry transcripts, but her eyes kept drifting to the security monitor in the corner of the room. It was a grainy, black and white feed of the main courtyard, but she could easily pick out the silhouette of Seo Mujin. He was standing by his usual pillar, a black umbrella held with mechanical stillness. He wasn't looking at his phone or packing like the other parents. He was watching the doors. Zuri felt a prickle of heat on her neck. She knew that earlier that afternoon, Sterling had called the local precinct to voice concerns about Mujin's presence. The air on campus was brittle, like ice about to crack. Zuri moved toward the back of the library, where the acoustics were dampened by heavy velvet curtains. She found Myram at her usual table. Today, the girl wasn't drawing. She was staring at a blank sheet of vellum, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her uniform. The silence coming from the girl felt different today. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the silence of a held breath. "He's still there, Myram," Zuri whispered, pulling out a chair. "He hasn't moved." Myram's eyes flicked to Zuri. For the first time, Zuri saw a flash of raw, unfiltered fear. Myram reached for her pencil and with trembling fingers drew a single, jagged Nsibidi symbol. It was the sign for enclosure. Around it, she scratched tiny Korean characters that translated to "the cage is closing." Before Zuri could respond, a shadow fell over the table. It wasn't Mujin. It was Sterling, flanked by two men in gray security uniforms. "Shifts over, Zuri," Sterling said, his voice dripping with a false, oily kindness. "And Myram, dear, we have some people who want to talk to you in the counseling wing. Just a few questions about your home life. Your guardian will have to wait outside the gate today." Myram's face went bone white. She looked at Zuri, her eyes pleading. The report was being weaponized. By moving Myram to a private room and pushing Mujin off campus, they were effectively isolating her to force a verbal response or a reason to call Child Protective Services. Zuri stood up, her pulse thundering. "Mr. Sterling, the registrar's protocols require a witness for any student interview involving outside security. As the evening administrator on duty, I am legally obligated to attend." Sterling's eyes narrowed into slits. "You're a clerk, Zuri. Don't overstep. Go back to your files." "I am a witness," Zuri said, using the word Myram had drawn the night before. She realized then that Myram hadn't just been drawing for herself. She had been giving Zuri a role to play. Suddenly, the library doors didn't just open, they seemed to yield. Mujin walked in. He had bypassed the gate. He wasn't running, but the sheer momentum of his stride made the security guard step back instinctively. Water dripped from his black coat, pooling on the expensive rug. The dragon tattoo on his neck looked darker in the dim light, pulsing with the tension in his jaw. "The school day ended 10 minutes ago," Mujin said. The quietness of his voice was more terrifying than a shout. It was the sound of a man who had already decided how the next 60 seconds would go. "Mr. CO, you were told to stay behind the perimeter," Sterling stammered, his bravado evaporating. "This is a private facility, and we have filed a formal." Mujin didn't look at Sterling. He looked at Myerm. He saw the blank vellum, the trembling hands, and the way Zuri was standing between the girl and the guards. His gaze shifted to Zuri, and for a split second, there was a silent communication between them, an acknowledgement of the enclosure. "Myerm," Mujin said, extending his hand. "We are leaving." The guards moved to block the path. Mujin didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't even raise his fists. He simply stepped into their space, his presence an immovable wall of shadow. The sheer weight of his reputation, the gang leader the school so feared, became a physical barrier. The guards, realizing they were outclassed not by violence, but by a man who had nothing left to lose, stepped aside. Mujin took Myerm's hand. As they passed Zuri, he paused. He didn't say thank you. He didn't offer an explanation. He simply looked at the Nsibidi symbol for witness on the paper and then back at Zuri. "The archives hold more than just records, Professor," he murmured, using her former title, a title she had told no one at this school. As they walked out into the rain, Zuri realized the mystery was far deeper than a mob boss protecting a child. Mujin knew who she was. He knew her history. And as she watched the black SUV pull away from the curb, she realized that the report Sterling had filed wasn't just a threat to Mujin. It was a fuse to a bomb that had been ticking since the night of the fire. The basement of St. Jude Academy was a labyrinth of steam pipes and forgotten blueprints, a place where the prestige of the upper floors vanished into the grit of the foundation. Zuri spent the night there, fueled by black coffee and the terrifying realization that CO Mujin knew her secrets. She was supposed to be purging old files, but she was hunting for something else. The original fire marshal's report from 3 years ago. It took hours of digging through digitized boxes labeled "property damage unresolved." When she finally found the file, her breath hitched. The fire hadn't happened in a warehouse or a dock. It had happened at a multilingual cultural center, a place where Korean and West African immigrants had shared a communal space. The report was clinical, but the photos were a nightmare of blackened timber and melted glass. Under the section titled "Victims," she saw the names. Myerm's parents, linguists who had been working on a cross-cultural literacy project. And next to them, CO Muhyok, Mujin's younger brother. The cause was listed as accidental, but a handwritten note in the margin, initialed by a detective who had since retired, caught her eye. "Accelerant found near the language lab. Witness suppressed. Case closed by City Hall." "Witness suppressed," Zuri whispered, the words echoing in the cold basement. She pulled out Myerm's latest drawing, the Nsibidi script for witness. It wasn't just a sign, it was an accusation. Myerm hadn't stopped speaking because of trauma alone. She had stopped speaking because the truth she held was a death sentence. And Mujin hadn't just adopted her, he had become her silent sentinel. The only man with enough darkness in his past to keep the light in her future from being extinguished. Zuri's thoughts were interrupted by a soft thud at the basement door. She quickly hid the file under a stack of folders. "The light in the basement is usually a sign of a thief or a saint," a voice rumbled. Mujin stood in the doorway. He wasn't wearing his coat this time. He was in a simple black shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal tattoos that told a story of a long, painful journey through the underworld. He looked tired, the shadows under his eyes matching the darkness of the room. "How did you get in here?" Zuri asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I own the company that provides the school's security software," Mujin said, stepping into the room. "Sterling is too busy checking my criminal record to notice who signs his maintenance contracts." He walked over to the table and saw the edge of the fire report sticking out. He didn't move to take it. He just stared at it, his expression unreadable. "My brother was a teacher," Mujin said, his voice dropping to a low, mournful tone. He believed that if people spoke the same language, they couldn't hate each other. Mayurm's parents believed the same. They were building something beautiful in that center. And someone burned it down, Zuri said. Mujin finally looked at her. They wanted the land. They wanted the silence. I am a man of the shadows, Zuri. I know how to hurt people. I know how to take things. But my brother, he was the only good thing our family ever produced. When he died, I took Mayurm because she was the only one who saw the faces of the men who lit the match. She is the only witness left. That's why you keep her silent, Zuri realized, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with a terrifying snap. As long as she doesn't speak, she can't testify. And as long as she can't testify, they won't kill her. The report Sterling filed is a beacon, Mujin said, his hand clenching into a fist. The men who burned that building are still in the city. They have seats on boards. They have friends in the DA's office. If the school forces an evaluation, if a state-appointed psychologist gets her to talk, she is a dead girl walking. Zuri looked at the drawing of the enclosure. She realized that the school wasn't just a place of learning. It was a cage that was slowly being surrounded by predators. And Seo Mujin, the gang leader, was the only thing standing between Mayurm and the ash. I can help you, Zuri said, her voice steadying. I'm not just a registrar. I was a professor of semiotics. I can teach her to speak without making a sound. We can record her testimony in a way they can't track. Mujin stared at her for a long time. The silence in the basement was heavy with the weight of 2 lives that had been destroyed by the same kind of powerful, faceless greed. Why? Mujin asked. You have your own life to rebuild. Why risk it for us? Zuri looked at the photo of the charred language lab. Because I'm tired of being a witness to my own disappearance. It's time we both broke the silence. Mujin nodded slowly. Tomorrow then, but be careful, Professor. In this city, the truth doesn't just set you free, it sets you on fire. As he disappeared back into the shadows of the basement, Zuri looked down at her hands. They were covered in the soot of old files, the archive of ash finally giving up its secrets. The mystery was no longer about Mujin's past, it was about Mayurm's future, and the battle for her voice had only just begun. The air in the Seattle morning felt like a damp wool blanket, heavy and gray. Zuri arrived at St. Jude Academy before the first bells, her bag weighted down by more than just textbooks. After her clandestine meeting with Seo Mujin in the basement, the very architecture of the school felt different. The marble columns looked less like pillars of education and more like the bars of a very expensive cage. She spent the morning watching the perimeter. She noticed the subtle changes Mujin had mentioned. There were new cars parked across the street, sedans with tinted windows that didn't belong to the wealthy parents of the student body. The security Sterling had summoned was no longer just a few men in gray uniforms. It was a presence, a watchful eye that seemed to follow Mayurm's every move. During the afternoon art elective, Zuri slipped into the back of the studio. Mayurm was there, sitting apart from the other children who were haphazardly splashing watercolors onto canvases. Mayurm's desk was pristine, save for a single sheet of paper and a pencil that had been sharpened down to a nub. I have something for you, Zuri whispered, sliding a long wooden box across the table. Mayurm's eyes widened as she opened it. Inside was a set of traditional Korean calligraphy brushes, their bristles made of fine wolf hair, and a stone ink well from Nigeria, carved with the very Nsibidi symbols they had been studying. It was a bridge, a physical manifestation of the 2 worlds that lived inside the girl. Mujin didn't just buy these, Zuri said, watching Mayurm's small fingers trace the carving on the stone. He found them in the ruins of the center. He's been keeping them safe for 3 years, waiting for the day you were ready to hold them again. Mayurm picked up the largest brush. She didn't use it to paint a picture. She dipped it into the dark, indigo ink and began to write. The motion was fluid, a dance of wrist and spirit. She wasn't drawing geometric lines anymore. She was writing names. Names of the people who had been in the center. Names of the men who had stood outside with matches. As Zuri watched, she realized that Mujin's gift wasn't just a tool, it was permission. He was telling Mayurm that she didn't have to hide her language anymore. If the school wanted to audit her, if the state wanted to evaluate her, she would give them a testimony they couldn't decipher without Zuri's help. "They think you are silent because you are broken," Zuri said, her voice a low, fierce anchor. "Show them that you are silent because you are the keeper of the flame." By the end of the hour, the paper was covered in a breathtaking mural of script and shadow. It looked like art to the passing teachers, but to Zuri, it was a ledger of crimes. Mayerm looked up, and for the first time there was a spark of something other than fear in her eyes. It was defiance. As the bell rang, Sterling appeared at the door, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Mayerm's desk. He walked over, his lip curling at the sight of the traditional tools. "What is this primitive mess?" Sterling asked, reaching for the paper. Mayerm didn't flinch. She placed her hand firmly over the calligraphy, her eyes locked onto his. The silence was no longer a retreat, it was a confrontation. "It's an elective, Mr. Sterling," Zuri intervened, her tone ice-cold. "And as the registrar, I've already logged this as a linguistic study. If you touch it, you're interfering with a recorded academic assessment." Sterling pulled his hand back as if he had been burned. He looked from the girl to the clerk he had tried to dismiss. He could feel the power shifting, the gang leader's shadow growing longer even when he wasn't in the room. He turned and left without a word, but the way his radio crackled as he walked away told Zuri the audit was moving to its final, most dangerous stage. The tension at St. Jude finally snapped on a Tuesday afternoon. The rain had turned into a torrential downpour, turning the cliffs into a wall of falling water. Zuri was in the main foyer when the black SUVs didn't just pull up, they were blocked. 3 city-marked vehicles had taken the primary spots, and men in dark windbreakers with state services printed on the back were standing at the entrance. Sterling stood with them, a smug, triumphant smile on his face. "Mr. CO is currently being detained for a traffic violation 3 blocks away," Sterling announced to the faculty gathered in the hall. "In his absence, the state has issued a temporary protective order for Mayerm. We are conducting a mandatory psychological and safety audit." Zuri felt the world tilt. Mujin was trapped, and the predators were inside the house. She looked toward the library, where she knew Mayerm was waiting. "You can't do this without her legal guardian present," Zuri said, stepping forward, her voice ringing through the marble foyer. "The state is her guardian for the next 6 hours, Zuri," Sterling replied. "Now, stay out of the way before you're cited for obstruction." Zuri didn't stay out of the way. She ran. She took the back stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs like a bird in a cage. She burst into the library to find Mayerm standing by the window, her hand pressed against the glass as she watched the flashing lights at the gate. "Mayerm, listen to me," Zuri panted, grabbing the girl's shoulders. "They're coming. They want to take you to a facility where Mujin can't reach you. They think if they get you alone, you'll break." Mayerm looked at Zuri, her small face a mask of cold, calculated thought. She didn't panic. She walked to the table and picked up the calligraphy brush Mujin had given her. "No," Zuri said. "Not a drawing, not today. If you want to stop them, you have to use the one thing they don't think you have. You have to use the truth." Zuri pulled out her phone and started a recording. "They think Mujin is the monster. They think he's the one who hurt you. If you go with them, they will use your silence to put him in prison forever. Is that what you want?" Mayerm stared at the screen. She thought of the man who smelled of sandalwood and sorrow, the man who had sat in his car every day for 3 years just to make sure she walked through a door safely. She thought of the dragon tattoo on his neck and the way his hand shook when he looked at the fire report. Outside the library, the heavy footsteps of the state agents echoed on the hardwood. "Mayerm, please," Zuri whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "Break the silence, not for them, for him." The library doors swung open. Sterling entered, followed by a woman with a clipboard and 2 uniformed officers. "Mayerm, it's time to go," the woman said, her voice patronizingly sweet. "We're going to take you somewhere safe, away from the bad man." Mayerm didn't move. She looked at the woman, then at Sterling. Finally, she looked at Zuri. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the first breath of a girl who was no longer afraid of the ash. She didn't speak to the agents. She didn't speak to Sterling. She looked directly into Zuri's camera and opened her mouth. "Seo Mujin is my father," she said. The voice was tiny, cracked, and barely a whisper, but it hit the room like a lightning strike. Sterling froze. The agents stopped in their tracks. The silence of 3 years hadn't just been broken, it had been shattered. "And the men who burned the house," Meyerm continued, her voice growing stronger with every syllable, "are the ones who pay for this school." The library went deathly quiet. Zuri kept the camera rolling, her hand trembling with a mixture of terror and triumph. Meyerm hadn't just spoken, she had named the enemy. She had pointed the finger at the very foundations of St. Jude. The mystery was no longer about a silent girl. It was about a conspiracy that went all the way to the top. And as the sound of Mujin's black SUV finally roaring through the gate echoed from the courtyard, Zuri knew the audit was over. The war, however, had just begun. The library of St. Jude Academy had never felt so small. Meyerm's voice, though barely more than a raspy thread, seemed to vibrate against the glass of the tall windows. The state agents stood paralyzed, their authority dissolving in the face of a truth that didn't fit their narrative. Sterling's face had turned a mottled, sickly shade of purple. He looked less like a prestigious administrator and more like a cornered animal. That is a coached response," Sterling finally stammered, his finger trembling as he pointed at Zuri. "You've manipulated the child. This recording is inadmissible. It's a fabrication." Zuri didn't lower the phone. "The only fabrication here, Sterling, is the idea that Meyerm was unstable." She was terrified, and she just told us exactly who she was terrified of. Meyerm stepped toward Zuri, her small hand finding the registrars. The physical contact was an anchor. Meyerm's eyes remained fixed on the woman from State Services, a cold, piercing gaze that demanded to be heard. "I have the names," Meyerm said, her voice gaining a strange, melodic clarity. It was a rhythmic cadence, the byproduct of the secret language she had built over 3 years. She wasn't just speaking, she was reciting. "The men who met in the basement of the center, the ones who spoke of urban renewal and erasing the clutter. I didn't forget their voices, and I didn't forget the symbol on their rings." She reached for the vellum on the table and with a few swift strokes of the wolf hair brush, drew a specific mark. It was an Nsibidi symbol for liar, but it was overlaid with a stylized SJ, the crest of St. Jude Academy. The woman from the state looked at the clipboard, then at the drawing, and then at Sterling. The professional distance she had maintained was crumbling. "Mr. Sterling, you told us the child was nonverbal and lacked cognitive clarity. This does not appear to be a child lacking clarity." Before Sterling could respond, the heavy oak doors of the library didn't just open, they were thrown wide. Seo Mujin entered. He was soaked to the bone, his hair plastered to his forehead, and his breathing was heavy. He looked like he had run the 3 blocks from where his car had been detained. His eyes swept the room, landing on Meyerm. When he saw her standing there, her mouth open, her eyes bright with the fire of speech, he stopped dead. "Meyerm," he whispered. "Mujin," she said, the name sounding like a prayer. The hardened criminal, the man whose tattoos were designed to keep the world at bay, fell to his knees. He didn't care about the state agents or the police officers or the scandal. He reached out, and Meyerm ran into his arms. The silence that had defined their lives for 3 years was gone, replaced by the soft, muffled sounds of a man finally allowing himself to weep. "She spoke," Zuri said, her own voice thick with emotion. "She broke the silence to save you, Mujin." Mujin pulled back, his hands framing Meyerm's face. He looked at her as if she were a miracle he wasn't sure he could touch. "I promised your mother I would protect you. I thought the silence was the shield. I was wrong." He stood up, his height and presence returning, but the energy was different. It wasn't the dark, predatory energy of the gang leader. It was the focused, lethal protective power of a father. He turned to the state agent. "My car was stopped by men who claimed to be officers but had no badges," Mujin stated, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "They tried to keep me from this school because they knew today was the day Sterling would try to take her. I want a formal record of this incident. I want the names of every board member who authorized this audit." The agent nodded, her pen moving rapidly over the clipboard. "Mr. CO, we will be taking Myerm for a formal statement at the precinct, not a state facility. We will require her to be accompanied by you and her translator." She looked at Zuri. Sterling tried to move toward the door, but one of the uniformed officers stepped in his way. "Stay right there, sir. There are some questions about the SJ symbol the girl just identified in connection to a cold case arson." As they were escorted out, Myerm looked back at the library, the room that had been her sanctuary and her prison. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, crushed leaf Zuri had seen in the very first 4K feed. She laid it on the table, a final gift to the silence she was leaving behind. The precinct was a blur of fluorescent lights and the smell of stale coffee. While Myerm was in a private room with a specialist and a court-certified linguist, Mu-jin and Zuri sat in the hallway. The power dynamic had shifted once again. The boss was now a man awaiting judgment, and the clerk was the architect of his survival. "You knew," Zuri said, breaking the long silence between them. "You knew who I was before you hired me. You knew about my history in Nigeria." Mu-jin didn't look at her. He was staring at his tattooed hands, specifically the dragon's tail that curled around his thumb. "I don't leave things to chance, Zuri. When my brother died, he left behind a list of names. People who could be trusted if the world turned dark. Your name was on it. He admired your work on the preservation of oral histories. He said you were a woman who understood that a story is the only thing a fire can't kill." Zuri felt a lump in her throat. "He was a good man, your brother." "He was the best of us," Mu-jin replied. "I spent my life making sure people like him could exist in the light while I stayed in the mud. I thought if I kept Myerm quiet, she could stay in the light, too. But the light doesn't protect you if the people holding the torches are the ones who want to see you burn." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger. He handed it to Zuri. "This is for you." Zuri opened it. Her eyes widened. It wasn't a ledger of criminal activity. It was a detailed record of bank transfers, legal filings, and investigative reports. Mu-jin hadn't just been hiding Myerm. He had been conducting a shadow war for 3 years. "You've been funding my legal defense," Zuri whispered, seeing her own name in the records. "The anonymous donors who kept my case alive in the high court. That was you." "My brother believed in you," Mu-jin said simply. "And Myerm needed a teacher who wasn't afraid of the dark. I wasn't just paying for your silence, Zuri. I was paying for your return. I wanted you to have your chair back at the university. I wanted you to be the woman who could help her tell the world what happened." The door to the interview room opened. The specialist walked out, looking stunned. "We've never seen anything like it. She's provided names, dates, and locations. But more than that, she's provided a linguistic map of the conspirators' communications. They were using a proprietary encryption based on the school's own software. She figured out the key by watching the administrator's emails during library hours." Zuri looked at Mu-jin. The young black girl hadn't just broken the silence, she had dismantled a corporate empire. She hadn't been a victim waiting for a hero, she had been a genius waiting for a bridge. "She's done it, Mu-jin," Zuri said, a tear finally escaping. "It's over." Mu-jin stood up, his shoulders finally losing the tension they had carried for 3 long years. "It's not over. It's just starting. They will come for us through the courts now, not the shadows, but we have the witness." He walked toward the door to greet Myerm, but he stopped and looked back at Zuri. "Professor, there is a position opening up at the new foundation I'm building. It's a school for children like Myerm, children who have been silenced by power. I think it needs a registrar who knows how to read the truth." Zuri smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time since she had arrived in Seattle. "I think I can find the time." As Myerm walked out and took Mu-jin's hand, she looked at Zuri and spoke one final word. It wasn't in Korean or English or Nsibidi. It was a word that needed no translation. Home. The grand ballroom of the Seattle Municipal Courthouse felt like a cathedral of cold justice. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, floor wax, and the electric tension of a city holding its breath. This was the final school board hearing, a proceeding that had been elevated to a state-level inquiry after Mayerm's raspy, world-shaking testimony at the precinct. Seo Mujin sat at the defense table, but he did not look like the defendant the media had painted him to be. He wore a sharp, charcoal-gray suit that concealed the dragon ink on his neck, though the strength of the man beneath was unmistakable. To his left sat Zuri, her posture regal, clutching a briefcase that contained the linguistic ledger of promises. Across the aisle, the board members of St. Jude Academy sat in a row, looking like a collection of wax figures. They were flanked by high-priced attorneys who had spent the last week trying to bury the arson investigation under mountains of procedural motions. Sterling was noticeably absent. He was currently being held in a separate facility, his silence finally mirroring the one he had tried to exploit in Mayerm. The presiding officer, a woman with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen every trick in the book, cleared her throat. This hearing is convened to determine the permanent guardianship of Mayerm and to address the allegations of corporate espionage and arson linked to the St. Jude endowment. Mr. Seo, your reputation preceded you in our preliminary briefings, but the evidence provided by the registrar's office paints a different picture. Zuri stood up. She didn't look like a clerk. She looked like the professor she was. Your Honor, the incident reports filed against Mr. Seo were not measures of safety. They were measures of suppression. The board of St. Jude wasn't protecting a child. They were trying to silence a witness who had decoded their financial ties to the urban renewal fires 3 years ago. She opened her laptop and projected an image onto the large courtroom screens. It was a digital overlay of Mayerm's calligraphy. These drawings, Zuri explained, her voice steady and resonant, are not the ramblings of a traumatized child. They are a phonetic record of the board's private meetings, which were held in the school library. Mayerm didn't just hear them. She archived them in a language they couldn't read. She used Nsibidi to hide the what and Hanja to hide the who. The courtroom erupted in a low murmur. The board members shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting to the exit. Then the back doors of the courtroom opened. Mayerm walked in. She was no longer wearing the stifling uniform of St. Jude. She wore a simple, bright yellow dress that made her look like a spark of light in the gray room. She walked down the center aisle, her head held high. She didn't look at the cameras or the lawyers. She looked only at Mujin. He stood up as she reached the table. For a moment, the entire room vanished. It was just the two of them, the man who had lived in the shadows to keep her safe, and the girl who had found her voice to set him free. Mayerm, the presiding officer said softly, are you prepared to speak? Mayerm stepped up to the witness stand. She had to stand on a small wooden crate to reach the microphone. She looked out at the board members, the men who had funded the matches that burned her world. My mother told me that names have power, Mayerm began. Her voice was no longer a whisper. It was a clear, steady bell. You took their names. You took their building. You thought that if I didn't speak, the truth would be buried in the ash. She reached into her bag and pulled out a single, charred piece of wood, a remnant of the cultural center. She laid it on the witness stand. I am the witness, she said, her voice echoing off the high marble walls. And my silence didn't mean I wasn't listening. It meant I was waiting for a name you couldn't erase. She began to recite. She recited the dates of the meetings. She recited the amounts of the wire transfers. She recited the names of the men who had stood in the basement and laughed about the cleansing of the neighborhood. As she spoke, the glass of the high windows seemed to vibrate with the frequency of her truth. One by one, the board members lowered their heads. The young black girl hadn't just broken the silence. She had shattered the glass ceiling of their corruption. The achievement wasn't just in her speech. It was in the total, undeniable restoration of her power. 3 months later, the cliffs of Seattle felt different. The gray mist was still there, but it no longer felt like a shroud. It felt like a fresh start. The St. Jude Academy was gone, its charter revoked, and its board members facing decades in prison. In its place, a new sign had been erected at the gates, the Muhyok Foundation for Cross-Cultural Literacy. Zuri stood on the balcony of the main building, watching the first group of students arrive. They were children from all over the city, some who spoke 3 languages, some who spoke none, and all of whom had been found in the margins of society. She was no longer a registrar. She was the dean of studies, her professorship restored not just by a court order, but by the work she was doing here. Seo Mujin walked up behind her. He wasn't wearing a suit today. He wore a simple sweater, the dragon tattoo on his neck partially visible, no longer a symbol of a gang leader, but a mark of a guardian who had survived the fire. "The library is full," Mujin said, his voice holding a warmth that Zuri had once thought impossible. "We had to order more calligraphy sets. Myrmb insisted every student gets a set made of wolf hair." Zuri smiled, leaning against the railing. She knows that the right tools make the truth easier to write. How is she doing? "She's in the courtyard," Mujin said, gesturing below. They both looked down. Myrmb was sitting in the center of a circle of children. She wasn't drawing in a corner. She was teaching. Her hands moved in the air as she explained the connection between a Korean symbol for heart and an African symbol for loyalty. She was laughing. The sound was the most beautiful thing Zuri had ever heard, a bright, resonant melody that carried across the gardens. Myrmb had achieved more than just a legal victory. She had achieved a life where her voice was a bridge, not a secret. "You did it, Mujin," Zuri said quietly. "You kept the promise." "We did it," he corrected her. He looked at Zuri, and for the first time there was no shadow of the boss left in his eyes. "I spent so long watching the world through cameras, trying to spot the enemy. I forgot that the most important thing to watch was the person standing right in front of me." He reached out and shook Zuri's hand, a formal gesture, but one filled with the weight of a shared history. "Thank you, Professor, for being the witness when we couldn't be." As the sun began to break through the Seattle clouds, casting a golden light over the foundation, Myrmb looked up and saw them on the balcony. She didn't wave a silent hand. She stood up and shouted, "Mujin, Zuri, come down, we're starting the new story." The young black girl had not just broken the silence, she had created a new syntax for a new world. A world where names weren't taken, but celebrated. A world where the ink on a man's skin was just a chapter in a much larger book. As Mujin and Zuri walked down the stairs to join her, the mystery was finally, fully resolved. There were no more unanswered questions. There was only the sound of children talking, the scratch of brushes on paper, and the quiet, steady rhythm of a home built on the truth. The achievement was complete. The silence was over. And for the first time in 3 years, everyone could finally breathe. The final lesson of this journey lies not in the destruction of the St. Jude Academy, but in the quiet foundation laid afterward. It serves as a reminder that the world often mistakes silence for absence, when in reality, silence is often the most densely packed form of information. The take-home from the story of Mujin, Zuri, and Myrmb is a challenge to our perception of power and communication. We are reminded that true protection is not found in walls or surveillance, but in the creation of a safe space where a voice can finally bloom. Mujin's tattoos, once symbols of a life of shadows, were ultimately outshone by the simple, clear words of a child. This tells us that while the past shapes our skin, our choices define our soul. From an educational standpoint, we witness the triumph of literacy over legacy. The conspirators at St. Jude relied on a legacy of old money and structural exclusion, but they were dismantled by a 10-year-old girl who understood the syntax of their greed. It proves that knowledge, especially the kind that bridges cultures, is the ultimate equalizer. When Myrmb merged Nsibidi with Hanja, she didn't just create a code. She created a world that her enemies were too narrow-minded to enter. Ultimately, the story leaves us with a moral mandate. Be the witness. In any system that seeks to suppress the truth, there is a vital need for a Zuri, someone with the intellectual courage to translate the cries of the marginalized, and a Mujin, someone with the strength to hold back the dark until the light can find its way through. The syntax of home is a language we all must learn. It is a language where witness means guardian, where silence means preparation, and where home is the sound of a truth finally set free. As the mist clears over the Seattle cliffs, The echo of Meyerm's voice remains, a permanent anchor in a world that will never again be able to say it didn't hear her.